snow had started falling just after dusk, blanketing the small town of Ashcroft in a soft, quiet hush. It wasn't an unusual sight in late December, but something about the way the snow caught the pale glow of the streetlights gave the streets an almost dreamlike quality. Houses lined neatly along narrow roads were dressed in strings of twinkling lights that shimmered against the frosted windows. Everything looked still, like a postcard come to life, yet somehow untouched by time. Rachel Foster glanced at her watch as she adjusted her scarf, the cold air biting at her cheeks. It was just after 5 p.m., but the early winter darkness made it feel much later. Her breath puffed in small, silvery clouds as she hurried across the icy sidewalk toward her car, parked near the town's modest grocery store. Ashcroft wasn't the kind of place that changed much. The same small handful of businesses had occupied Main Street for as long as Rachel could remember. Mel's Diner with its peeling neon sign, the hardware store where old man Bixby still worked behind the counter, and Frosted Pines Market, a store just big enough to stock the essentials, but small enough that everyone still greeted each other by name. It was comforting in a way, predictable. Rachel had returned to Ashcroft a year ago after her mother passed, leaving behind a bustling life in Chicago to care for the creaky, century-old family home perched on the edge of town. It wasn't exactly the life she'd envisioned for herself, but the quiet felt right after years of city noise and constant motion. Besides, she figured she owed it to her mother to at least try to keep the house in one piece, even if it did mean the occasional struggle with a stubborn furnace or a drafty window. She popped the trunk of her car, loading the last of her groceries inside. A modest haul of canned soup, bread, and enough coffee to last through another week. Her boots crunched against the fresh layer of snow as she slammed the trunk shut, lingering for a moment to take in the view of Main Street. It was familiar, almost too familiar. The same few cars parked along the curb, the same friendly faces passing by with polite nods, or a quick "stay warm" tossed over their shoulders. The bell above the grocery store jingled as an older couple exited, their laughter muffled by the scarves wrapped tightly around their faces. Across the street, a group of kids bundled in oversized coats took turns daring each other to climb the low fence of the town's old churchyard. The church itself loomed quietly behind them, its steeple shrouded in shadows. Even in daylight, Rachel thought, the place always had an eerie, hollow kind of presence, though, she supposed, that might just be the age of the building. Everything old carried a little mystery, didn't it? She shook off the thought and climbed into her car, cranking the heat up as the engine sputtered to life. She'd barely driven a block when her phone buzzed in the cup holder. Pulling up at a stop sign, she glanced at the screen. It was a text from her neighbor, Mrs. Linwood, who lived just down the street from her. "Snow's picking up. Be safe driving home. By the way, your porch light was flickering when I walked by earlier. Might want to check it out." Rachel frowned slightly. The house was old, yes, but she just replaced that bulb a few weeks ago. Then again, this wasn't the first time something in the house had decided to stop cooperating out of nowhere. She made a mental note to look into it as soon as she got back. The drive home took less than 10 minutes. Outside the car, the wind had begun to pick up, swirling the snow into thin, restless eddies across the street. Rachel pulled into the gravel driveway and grabbed her groceries from the trunk, careful to avoid slipping on the thin layer of ice beneath the snow. The house stood at the edge of the woods, its steep, gabled roof and wide front porch giving it a charm that Rachel had always loved, even as a child. Now, though, the windows glowed faintly, and she felt a flicker of gratitude for the steady warmth inside. Her boots thudded softly against the wooden steps as she climbed the porch, pausing to glance up at the light fixture by the front door. Sure enough, the bulb was flickering, casting uneven shadows across the peeling paint of the porch railings. Rachel set the groceries down and reached up, tapping the fixture lightly. The bulb stuttered once, then twice, before going dark completely. "Great," she muttered under her breath. "Guess it's you and me, flashlight." As she fished for her keys, the sound of a far-off owl echoed from the woods. Its haunting cry carried on the wind. Rachel paused for just a moment, her eyes flicking toward the tree line. The forest stood silent, unmoving, as though holding its breath beneath the weight of the falling snow. She shook off the unease that tugged at the edge of her mind and pushed the door open, carrying the groceries inside. Warmth greeted her like an old friend, along with the faint scent of pine from the small Christmas tree she'd put up in the living room the week before. The house was quiet, save for the soft creak of the floorboards beneath her steps and the low hum of the radiator in the hallway. As Rachel began unpacking the groceries, she caught herself humming softly to fill the silence. The flickering light on the porch was still in the back of her mind, but it could wait. For now, she thought, everything felt normal, and maybe that was enough. The quiet hum of routine settled over Rachel as she moved through the house. She unpacked the groceries with the kind of efficiency that comes from doing something a dozen times before. Coffee in the cabinet to the left of the sink, bread in the ceramic box her mother had once used, canned goods neatly lined up in the pantry. The house, with all its old quirks and imperfections, always seemed to exhale after she returned, as if her presence kept its restless creaks and groans in check. After putting everything away, Rachel brewed a cup of coffee and curled up on the worn, overstuffed armchair by the window. She didn't bother with the lights. The glow from the Christmas tree was warm enough, casting soft shadows across the room. Outside, the snow continued to fall steadily, the flakes thicker now, drifting lazily in the faint glow of the porch light. It hadn't come back on after she'd tried tapping the bulb, and now the fixture sat dark, a smudge against the otherwise soft glow of the house. She thought about texting Mrs. Linwood back, maybe to let her know the light was officially out, but she decided against it. The older woman had a habit of stopping by unannounced if she thought something needed fixing, and Rachel wasn't in the mood for company tonight. Not that she didn't appreciate the neighborly kindness. It was just one of those evenings where the quiet felt necessary, comfortable. The coffee warmed her hands as she took a slow sip, her gaze drifting to the snow-covered woods beyond the backyard. It was a view she'd never quite gotten used to, even after a year of living here. The trees stood tall and dense, their dark forms outlined in the faint reflection of the snow. In the daylight, they were almost beautiful, a tangle of branches and shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. But at night, they were something else entirely, a wall of black that swallowed any trace of light. Rachel had never liked looking at them for too long after dark. There was something about the way the woods seemed so alive yet utterly still, like they were waiting for something. She brushed the thought aside, telling herself it was just her imagination, a holdover from too many late-night ghost stories as a kid. She glanced at the clock on the wall. 7:15. Early enough to still call it evening, but late enough to start settling in for the night. Her plan was simple: another cup of coffee, maybe a movie if the internet didn't decide to act up again, and then bed. It was a routine she'd come to enjoy, though she often thought about how quiet her nights had become since moving back. In Chicago, there was always something to do, friends to see, places to go. Here, the silence was constant, pressing in like the snow outside. Peaceful, yes, but sometimes heavy. A faint tapping sound broke her thoughts. She froze, the rim of the mug hovering near her lips, her eyes flicking toward the window. For a moment, she sat perfectly still, her heart thudding lightly in her chest. But the sound didn't come again, and when she glanced toward the window, the glass reflected nothing but the soft glow of the Christmas lights behind her. "Relax," she muttered to herself, setting the mug down on the side table. It was probably just a tree branch brushing against the side of the house. The wind had picked up since she'd gotten home, after all. She stood, stretching her legs, and crossed the room to adjust the thermostat. The house sighed quietly around her as she wandered back toward the kitchen, rinsing out her mug and setting it in the sink. The sound of running water filled the space, steady and rhythmic. For a brief moment, she caught her reflection in the kitchen window, a faint, ghostly outline framed by the dark woods beyond. She looked away quickly, suddenly aware of how much she disliked looking at windows at night. They always felt exposed somehow, vulnerable. She shook her head, pulling herself from her thoughts. Maybe it was the winter, or maybe it was just the quiet playing tricks on her. But she'd felt oddly restless all evening, like there was something just at the edge of her awareness, waiting to be noticed. "Okay," she said aloud, her voice breaking the silence as if to ground herself. "Movie it is." She turned off the kitchen light, her footsteps soft against the creaking floorboards as she headed back to the living room. As she passed by the front window, her eyes flicked toward the porch. The light was still out, of course, but she thought she saw a faint indentation in the fresh snow just at the edge of the steps. It could have been from earlier, maybe the mailman or even Mrs. Linwood on her way home. But Rachel couldn't remember seeing any tracks when she'd come in. She hesitated, her hand brushing against the curtain. For a moment, she thought about opening the door, stepping outside to take a closer look. But the thought of standing alone on the porch, with only the dark woods stretching out behind her, made her stomach twist. Instead, she pulled the curtain closed, shutting out the view entirely. Whatever it was, it could wait until morning. Rachel settled back into her chair, pulling a blanket across her lap as the soft whir of the heating system filled the room. She found herself scrolling through a streaming service on her laptop, half-heartedly searching for something to watch. Her mind, however, kept wandering back to the faint indentation she'd seen on the porch steps. It was probably nothing, she told herself again. Snow had a way of shifting, settling on its own. Tracks could blur, shadows could play tricks. Still, a small part of her couldn't quite let it go. The glow of the laptop screen lit up her face as she chose a movie. Something light and familiar, a romantic comedy she'd watched countless times. It wasn't long before the opening credits rolled, but even as the cheerful music filled the room, Rachel's eyes flicked occasionally toward the windows. The curtains were drawn now, the glass hidden from view, but the sensation of being watched lingered faintly, like an itch she couldn't quite scratch. She reminded herself that she was alone, and there was no reason to feel otherwise. About 20 minutes into the movie, a soft noise interrupted the dialogue on screen. It wasn't loud, just a faint, distant sound, almost imperceptible under the hum of the heater and the faint crackle of the radiator. Rachel paused the movie, tilting her head slightly as she listened. The house was still, quiet. She held her breath for a moment, straining to catch the sound again, but it didn't come. It might have been the wind outside, or the groan of the old wood shifting as the temperature dropped further. Still, something about it didn't sit right. She shook her head, almost laughing at herself. "You're being ridiculous," she muttered, letting the blanket fall from her lap as she stood to check the thermostat again, more for the sake of moving than anything else. She wasn't used to feeling so on edge. As she passed through the hallway, she glanced at the front door. It was locked, of course. She checked it twice after coming in. But now, standing there, she noticed the faintest chill seeping in from the edges of the frame. She placed a hand on the door, feeling the cold beneath her palm. The draft wasn't unusual. The old house had plenty of spots where the cold crept in, no matter how hard she tried to seal it up. She made a mental note to grab one of those draft stoppers from the hardware store the next time she went into town. Her fingers brushed against the deadbolt as she turned to walk back to the living room. It was locked, secure, but as she moved, her foot nudged something small near the base of the door, a slight weight that scraped softly against the floor. She crouched, frowning, and picked it up. It was a small, dried pine needle, brittle and brown. That wasn't unusual either, she supposed. The Christmas tree shed constantly, and somehow the needles always ended up in the oddest places. But this one wasn't green like the ones from her tree. This one looked older, more like it had come from outside. She straightened, brushing the thought aside, and dropped the pine needle into the small trash bin near the door. Back in the living room, she picked up her blanket again, draping it around her shoulders as she sank back into the armchair. The movie had paused on a bright, cheerful frame, a sharp contrast to the faint unease she couldn't quite shake. Rachel sighed, pressing play, willing herself to focus on the characters' playful banter instead of the cold draft, the sound that may or may not have been there, or the memory of the indentation in the snow outside. But her concentration faltered again when she caught something out of the corner of her eye. Just a flicker, something shifting in the dim reflection of the TV screen. She froze, her body stiffening as her eyes darted toward the source. It was nothing, just the tree lights, she realized after a beat. The faint flicker of the bulbs as they cycled through their soft, pulsing glow. She hadn't noticed it earlier, but it made sense. Nothing else in the room had moved. Still, her chest felt tight, and her skin prickled as she reached for the remote again, turning the volume up a little higher. The warmth of the blanket seemed less comforting now, and she found herself glancing over her shoulder once, then twice, as if expecting to see something or someone standing just behind her. The heater kicked on again, its low rumble breaking the silence. It was almost enough to drown out the faint tapping sound that followed. This time, she was certain it wasn't her imagination. It was faint, soft, almost polite, like the sound of fingertips brushing against the glass. It came from the direction of the kitchen. Rachel's breath caught, her hand tightening around the edge of the blanket. The tapping stopped as suddenly as it had started, and the only sound left was the hum of the heater and the faint buzz of the TV. She didn't move. Not at first. The rational part of her mind told her it was nothing, just a loose branch swaying in the wind. or maybe the house settling again. But the longer she sat there, unmoving, the more the silence seemed to press in, heavy and expectant, like it was waiting for her to react. And for the first time since she'd moved back into the house, Rachel found herself wondering if she really was alone. Rachel settled back into her chair, pulling a blanket across her lap as the soft whir of the heating system filled the room. She found herself scrolling through a streaming service on her laptop, half-heartedly searching for something to watch. Her mind, however, kept wandering back to the faint indentation she'd seen on the porch steps. It was probably nothing, she told herself again. Snow had a way of shifting, settling on its own. Tracks could blur, shadows could play tricks. Still, a small part of her couldn't quite let it go. The glow of the laptop screen lit up her face as she chose a movie, something light and familiar, a romantic comedy she'd watched countless times. It wasn't long before the opening credits rolled, but even as the cheerful music filled the room, Rachel's eyes flicked occasionally toward the windows. The curtains were drawn now, the glass hidden from view, but the sensation of being watched lingered faintly, like an itch she couldn't quite scratch. She reminded herself that she was alone, and there was no reason to feel otherwise. About 20 minutes into the movie, a soft noise interrupted the dialogue on screen. It wasn't loud, just a faint, distant sound, almost imperceptible, under the hum of the heater and the faint crackle of the radiator. Rachel paused the movie, tilting her head slightly as she listened. The house was still, quiet. She held her breath for a moment, straining to catch the sound again, but it didn't come. It might have been the wind outside, or the groan of the old wood shifting as the temperature dropped further. Still, something about it didn't sit right. She shook her head, almost laughing at herself. "You're being ridiculous," she muttered, letting the blanket fall from her lap as she stood to check the thermostat again, more for the sake of moving than anything else. She wasn't used to feeling so on edge. As she passed through the hallway, she glanced at the front door. It was locked, of course. She checked it twice after coming in. But now, standing there, she noticed the faintest chill seeping in from the edges of the frame. She placed a hand on the door, feeling the cold beneath her palm. The draft wasn't unusual. The old house had plenty of spots where the cold crept in, no matter how hard she tried to seal it up. She made a mental note to grab one of those draft stoppers from the hardware store the next time she went into town. Her fingers brushed against the deadbolt as she turned to walk back to the living room. It was locked, secure, but as she moved, her foot nudged something small near the base of the door, a slight weight that scraped softly against the floor. She crouched, frowning, and picked it up. It was a small, dried pine needle, brittle and brown. That wasn't unusual either, she supposed. The Christmas tree shed constantly, and somehow the needles always ended up in the oddest places. But this one wasn't green like the ones from her tree. This one looked older, more like it had come from outside. She straightened, brushing the thought aside, and dropped the pine needle into the small trash bin near the door. She stepped closer, her breath shallow, her eyes fixed on the glass. The tapping had stopped again, leaving nothing but an unnerving stillness. Her own reflection stared back at her in the faint light, wide eyes, pale skin, and a tangle of dark hair framing her face. She moved closer still, leaning slightly to peer through the glass into the snow-covered backyard. At first, she saw nothing but the outline of the trees and the faint glimmer of the porch light against the snow. But then, just as her eyes began to adjust, she saw it, a shape standing at the edge of the tree line. Rachel's stomach dropped. It was barely more than a shadow against the darkness of the woods, but its presence was undeniable. It stood motionless, tall and thin, its edges blurred by the snowfall. For a moment, she thought it might be a trick of the light, her mind conjuring shapes out of shadows. But then it moved ever so slightly, a slow, deliberate tilt of the head that sent a jolt of cold terror down her spine. Her hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp as she stumbled back from the window. She hadn't seen its face, or if it even had one, but the way it stood, the way it tilted its head as though watching her, was enough to send every nerve in her body screaming to run. The floor creaked beneath her weight, and for a moment she thought she might collapse from the sheer force of her own fear. But then she heard it, a sound that froze her in place. The front door rattled. It wasn't loud, just the faintest shudder of the wood against the frame, but it was enough to send her heart racing. She whipped her head toward the sound, her chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. The door rattled again, louder this time, the handle twisting ever so slightly, as if someone or something was testing it. Rachel's legs moved before her brain could catch up, propelling her back into the living room. She grabbed the heavy lamp from the side table, clutching it with both hands as she stared at the door. The rattling stopped abruptly, and for a moment, all she could hear was the blood rushing in her ears. Then, from the other side of the door, came the faintest sound of breathing. Slow, deep, deliberate. Rachel's grip on the lamp tightened, her knuckles white against the polished surface. She couldn't bring herself to speak, to call out, to do anything but stand there, trembling as the breathing grew louder, closer. And then, with horrifying clarity, she heard it again, the sound of tapping. But this time, it wasn't on the kitchen window. It was on the glass pane of the front door, just inches away. Rachel's grip on the lamp was so tight that the cold metal seemed to fuse with her trembling hands. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she stared at the door, the sound of tapping filling the space like a sinister metronome. Each tap was slow, deliberate, and impossibly precise. Her mind raced, every rational explanation dissolving under the weight of what her senses told her. She was not alone, and whatever was on the other side of that door was not supposed to be there. The tapping stopped suddenly, plunging the room into a suffocating silence. Rachel's ears strained against the stillness, her body frozen, every muscle locked in anticipation of what might happen next. The seconds stretched, each one feeling like an eternity. She fought the urge to move, to flee, but there was nowhere to go. The woods behind the house were no refuge, and the thought of opening any door to the outside sent a chill deeper than the winter air. Then, slowly, she heard it again, the handle of the front door creaking. This time, it wasn't a tentative movement. It was deliberate, forceful, the sound of metal grinding as though something on the other side was testing its strength against the lock. Rachel took a step back, her heartbeat so loud it drowned out the faint hum of the heater. Her voice caught in her throat, but she managed a strained, trembling whisper, as though speaking aloud might somehow anchor her to reality. "Go away," she breathed, her words barely audible over the growing thud of her pulse. She didn't even believe her own voice, fragile and weak against the oppressive air of the room. The handle stilled. For a moment, Rachel thought, prayed, that it was over, that whatever this was had stopped. But then, as though answering her desperate hope with malice. A loud, deliberate knock shattered the silence. It wasn't the polite tapping from before. This was a heavy, resonant thud, as though something massive was testing the door's very integrity. Rachel stumbled back further, her eyes darting to the curtains covering the living room window. She didn't dare look outside, terrified of what she might see, but the knowledge that something might already be watching her through the thin barrier sent a fresh wave of panic coursing through her. The lamp in her hands felt pitifully inadequate, her grip slick. Back in the living room, she picked up her blanket again, draping it around her shoulders as she sank back into the armchair. The movie had paused on a bright, cheerful frame, a sharp contrast to the faint unease she couldn't quite shake. Rachel sighed, pressing play, willing herself to focus on the characters' playful banter instead of the cold draft, the sound that may or may not have been there, or the memory of the indentation in the snow outside. But her concentration faltered again when she caught something out of the corner of her eye, just a flicker, something shifting in the dim reflection of the TV screen. She froze, her body stiffening as her eyes darted toward the source. It was nothing, just the tree lights, she realized after a beat, the faint flicker of the bulbs as they cycled through their soft, pulsing glow. She hadn't noticed it earlier, but it made sense. Nothing else in the room had moved. Still, her chest felt tight, and her skin prickled as she reached for the remote again, turning the volume up a little higher. The warmth of the blanket seemed less comforting now, and she found herself glancing over her shoulder once, then twice, as if expecting to see something or someone standing just behind her. The heater kicked on again, its low rumble breaking the silence. It was almost enough to drown out the faint tapping sound that followed. This time, she was certain it wasn't her imagination. It was faint, soft, almost polite, like the sound of fingertips brushing against the glass. It came from the direction of the kitchen. Rachel's breath caught, her hand tightening around the edge of the blanket. The tapping stopped as suddenly as it had started, and the only sound left was the hum of the heater and the faint buzz of the TV. She didn't move. Not at first. The rational part of her mind told her it was nothing, just a loose branch swaying in the wind, or maybe the house settling again. But the longer she sat there, unmoving, the more the silence seemed to press in, heavy and expectant, like it was waiting for her to react. And for the first time since she'd moved back into the house, Rachel found herself wondering if she really was alone. Rachel stayed perfectly still, her breath caught in her throat as her eyes darted toward the darkened kitchen. The tapping had stopped, but the silence it left behind was heavier than ever, pressing down on her chest. Every sound felt amplified. The faint ticking of the clock on the mantel, the slow creak of the radiator as it cooled, and the dull hum of the refrigerator in the next room. It was all so ordinary, so painfully familiar, but beneath it lingered something else, something wrong. She slowly slid the blanket off her shoulders, careful not to make a sound. Her pulse was pounding in her ears, but she forced herself to stand, gripping the edge of the chair for balance. The kitchen was just a few steps away, but the darkness felt impenetrable, a shadowy void that seemed to stretch far beyond what she knew was there. Her fingers hovered over the light switch on the wall, but she hesitated, the thought of flooding the room with light suddenly feeling too bold, too exposed. What if there was something in the dark that she didn't want to see? Or worse, what if the light revealed something waiting for her? No, that was ridiculous. It was her house, her space. There was nothing here but her own nerves getting the better of her. The thought barely settled in her mind when the sound came again. A slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap against the kitchen window. This time, it was unmistakable. Rachel's breath hitched as she whipped her head toward the sound, her body rigid. The tapping was lighter than a knock, but steady, deliberate, like the faint echo of knuckles against the glass. She couldn't move, her feet rooted to the floor. Her gaze locked on the shadowed doorway leading to the kitchen, her imagination filling the darkness with shapes that weren't really there. She wanted to tell herself it was a branch, just like before, but deep down, she knew. The taps were too precise, too calculated. Her body moved before her mind could stop it, taking one hesitant step forward, then another. The floor creaked softly beneath her weight, the sound slicing through the suffocating quiet. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself was working against her. When she reached the kitchen doorway, she paused, her fingers brushing against the cool plaster of the wall for stability. The room was dimly lit by the faint glow of the Christmas lights spilling in from the living room. It was enough to make out the shapes of the counters and the faint shimmer of the refrigerator's surface. But the window remained a dark rectangle, opaque and unreadable, with sweat as she clung to it like a lifeline. Another knock, louder this time. The door shuddered in its frame, and then, without warning, came the voice. It was low and raspy, barely more than a whisper, yet somehow it carried through the room like a shout. Rachel. The sound of her name, spoken in a tone that didn't belong to any human throat, made her knees buckle. It wasn't just the sound itself. It was the way the voice lingered, curling in the air like smoke, impossibly close, as if the door wasn't there at all. Rachel's breath hitched. She hadn't told anyone she'd be home tonight. No one knew she'd be alone. The rational part of her mind screamed at her to call for help, to grab her phone and dial 911. But her body refused to move. Her phone was on the side table, just a few feet away, but it might as well have been on the other side of the world. The voice came again, sharper this time, filled with something between anger and amusement. Rachel, let me in. A deep, primal fear welled up inside her. She took another step back, the heel of her boot catching on the edge of the rug, nearly sending her tumbling to the floor. She caught herself, but the lamp clattered loudly in her hands, and she winced at the sound. The voice on the other side of the door fell silent. For a moment, she thought it might be over, but then came the sound of scratching, long, deliberate strokes, like fingernails dragging across the wooden surface of the door. It started at the bottom and moved slowly upward, the grating noise sharp and deliberate, carving into her nerves with each passing second. Rachel's chest tightened as her back pressed against the far wall of the living room. She wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but her body felt locked in place, as though whatever was outside had frozen her in its grip. Her mind flashed back to the shadow she'd seen at the edge of the woods, the way it had tilted its head, watching her. She felt that same gaze now, even through the thick wooden door, like a weight pressing down on her chest. Then, without warning, the scratching stopped. The silence was even worse. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she stared at the door, waiting, dreading whatever might come next. The seconds dragged on, each one stretching into an unbearable eternity. And then, softly, the voice returned. "It's cold out here, Rachel." It was almost plaintive, mockingly so, as though whatever it was understood the human need for compassion, for reason, and twisted it into something unrecognizable. "Won't you open the door?" The words sent a shiver down her spine, her fingers clutching the wall behind her for support. She opened her mouth to scream, to yell, to do anything to drown out the voice, but no sound came. Her throat was dry, her fear choking her. The door rattled again, harder this time, the entire frame shaking as though something enormous was pushing against it. Rachel stumbled toward the side table, her hands fumbling for her phone. Her fingers closed around the device just as a deafening crash filled the room. It wasn't the door, it was the living room window, shattering inward as the curtains blew back, revealing the darkness beyond. And in that darkness, something moved. The cold air rushed into the room, carrying with it a biting chill that seemed to freeze Rachel in place. Shards of glass littered the floor, catching the faint glow of the Christmas lights as they flickered erratically, casting shifting shadows across the walls. She could barely process what she was seeing, her mind grasping at the edges of reason as the darkness outside seemed to seep into the house itself, thick and tangible. Her phone slipped from her trembling hands, clattering onto the hardwood floor as her gaze locked on the window. The curtains fluttered weakly in the frigid wind, framing the jagged hole where the glass had been. For a moment, nothing moved. The house held its breath, silent and still, save for the low hum of the heater and the faint whistle of the wind. And then she saw it. A shape emerged from the shadows beyond the window, tall and impossibly thin, its movements slow and deliberate. It didn't crawl or stumble like something clumsy and animalistic. It flowed, a dark silhouette against the pale snow outside, stepping with a grace that sent every instinct in Rachel's body screaming to run. But she couldn't. Her legs felt rooted to the floor, her breath shallow and ragged as the figure moved closer, its head tilting slightly in that same unsettling way she had seen before. The creature, or whatever it was, didn't enter immediately. It lingered at the edge of the shattered window, its elongated form barely visible in the faint light spilling from the room. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as it leaned forward, just enough for her to make out the outline of its face, or the lack of one. Where there should have been eyes, a nose, a mouth, there was only a smooth, featureless surface, like the surface of black glass, polished to a sickening sheen. Yet somehow she could feel its gaze on her, sharp and invasive, peeling back every layer of her being. "Rachel," it said again, the voice impossibly close now, though its featureless head didn't move. It wasn't loud, but it filled the room, resonating in her bones like a low humming vibration. "You let me in." The words weren't a request. They weren't even a question. They were a statement, cold and final, as if her consent had never mattered. The figure stepped through the window, its long, spindly limbs folding unnaturally as it passed into the room. Rachel stumbled backward, her foot catching on a piece of broken glass. Pain shot through her ankle, but she barely registered it, her focus locked on the thing in front of her. It didn't move toward her immediately. Instead, it straightened to its full height, its head nearly brushing the ceiling as it turned slowly, deliberately, taking in the room. Rachel's chest tightened as it turned back to her, its blank face tilting once more. "You didn't answer," it whispered, the voice softer now but no less piercing. Her back hit the wall, the corner of a framed photo digging into her shoulder. She wanted to scream, to plead, to demand answers, but her voice refused to come. All she could do was shake her head, tears spilling down her cheeks as the creature took a single deliberate step toward her. And then, just as the cold seemed to seep into her skin. Her mind caught on something small but clear. The front door. It was still locked. She hadn't opened it. The voice had said she let it in, but she hadn't. Not really. The thought burned in her chest, a tiny flicker of defiance against the overwhelming tide of fear. She hadn't let it in. She couldn't have. The creature seemed to sense the shift in her thoughts. It paused mid-step, its head tilting slightly as though studying her. "You think you know," it whispered, the voice softer now, almost amused. "But you don't. You've already opened the door." Rachel's stomach churned, her mind racing as the words settled into her. She wanted to argue, to deny it, but the creature took another step closer, its impossibly long arms stretching out toward her, and the thought fled. Suddenly there was a loud, sharp noise. A knock. It came from behind her, from the front door. Rachel's breath caught as she turned her head slightly, just enough to see the shadow of a figure through the frosted glass of the door. For a moment, her heart surged with hope. Someone was here. Someone had come. But then the creature laughed, a low, hollow sound that sent a fresh wave of dread crashing over her. "It's too late," it whispered, its voice curling around her like smoke. "I'm already inside." The knocking at the door grew louder, more frantic, but Rachel couldn't move. The creature's form seemed to blur and shift, folding into the shadows of the room as the lights flickered one last time and went out, plunging everything into darkness. In the silence that followed, the knocking stopped,